Two nuclear-armed giants stood face to face across a divided world, each holding enough firepower to end human civilization. For 45 years, they never blinked. They never fired a shot at each other. And yet, they fought the most dangerous war in human history. Berlin was split by concrete and barbed wire. Proxy armies clashed on distant continents. Spies traded secrets in shadowy alleys. An entire generation went to sleep wondering if they'd wake up to nuclear winter. The world became a chessboard where every move could trigger Armageddon, where the smallest miscalculation could turn the planet into radioactive ash, where peace was measured not by the absence of war, but by the presence of fear. The Cold War had begun. From alliance to enemies. In 1943, victory over Nazi Germany was finally within reach. The three great Allied powers, America, Britain, and the Soviet Union, began planning the post-war world. But beneath their wartime cooperation, fundamental disagreements were already brewing. Roosevelt wanted international cooperation through the United Nations. Churchill desperately tried to save the British Empire. Stalin demanded absolute security for the Soviet Union, which meant controlling Eastern Europe. At Yalta in February 1945, these conflicting visions collided. The leaders carved up Europe, agreeing that Poland would be reconstituted, but under Soviet influence. Germany would be divided into occupation zones. On the surface, it looked like compromise. In reality, it was the blueprint for a divided world. The warning signs appeared immediately. When Greece was liberated, communist resistance fighters clashed with British troops sent by Churchill. Stalin stayed out of Greece but tightened his grip on Poland, Romania, and Bulgaria. The wartime alliance was already cracking. Then came the moment that changed everything. On July 16, 1945, American scientists successfully tested the first atomic bomb in the New Mexico desert. When Truman casually mentioned this powerful new weapon to Stalin at Potsdam, the Soviet leader showed no emotion. But he understood perfectly. America now held the ultimate trump card. 3 weeks later, Hiroshima and Nagasaki were obliterated. Japan surrendered, but the nuclear age had begun. America stood alone as the world's only atomic power, while Stalin ordered his scientists to catch up at any cost. By 1946, the pretense of cooperation had collapsed entirely. Churchill's Iron Curtain speech in March painted a stark picture of Europe divided between freedom and communist tyranny. Stalin responded by installing puppet governments throughout Eastern Europe and pressuring Turkey and Iran for strategic concessions. The Truman Doctrine of 1947 marked America's official entry into the Cold War. Truman declared that the United States would support free peoples everywhere resisting subjugation. It was a blank check for global intervention. The Marshall Plan followed, flooding Western Europe with American aid to rebuild economies and strengthen democracies. Stalin's answer was the Cominform, binding communist parties under Soviet control. By 1948, Europe was divided into two armed camps. The first major crisis came when Stalin blockaded West Berlin, trying to starve the city into submission. For nearly a year, Allied aircraft supplied 2 million West Berliners in the greatest humanitarian airlift in history. When Stalin finally lifted the blockade in May 1949, the damage was irreversible. NATO was formed, binding Western Europe and North America in military alliance. Months later, the Soviet Union exploded its first atomic bomb, ending America's nuclear monopoly. In October, Mao's communists triumphed in China. The Cold War had gone global. The nuclear balance of terror. Korea became the first hot war of the Cold War era. On June 25, 1950, North Korean forces invaded the South in a surprise attack that caught everyone off guard. Truman responded through the United Nations, sending American troops to defend South Korea. But when UN forces approached the Chinese border, hundreds of thousands of Chinese volunteers poured across the Yalu River. The Korean War settled into a bloody stalemate that lasted 3 years. It established the pattern of proxy warfare. The superpowers would fight through allies while avoiding direct confrontation. The armistice signed in 1953 left Korea permanently divided by a demilitarized zone guarded by over 1 million soldiers. Dwight Eisenhower brought a new strategy to the White House: massive retaliation. Rather than matching Soviet conventional forces everywhere, America would rely on its nuclear superiority to deter aggression. Any Soviet attack would be met with overwhelming atomic force. It was cheaper than maintaining huge armies, but infinitely more dangerous. The CIA became America's secret weapon, orchestrating coups in Iran in 1953 and Guatemala in 1954 to protect Western interests. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union was consolidating its control over Eastern Europe. When Hungarian students and workers rose up against Soviet rule in October 1956, Soviet tanks crushed the revolution with brutal efficiency. The West could only watch and protest. The same year brought the Suez Crisis, when Britain, France, and Israel attacked Egypt to regain control of the nationalized Suez Canal. The Soviet Union threatened nuclear retaliation, while America forced its allies to withdraw. The crisis marked the end of European colonial power. Only the superpowers mattered now. Then came the shock that shattered American complacency. On October 4, 1957, the Soviet Union launched Sputnik into orbit. The basketball-sized satellite beeping overhead proved that Soviet missiles could now reach any target on Earth. America's first satellite attempt exploded on the launch pad, earning the nickname Kaputnik. The space race had begun, and the Soviets were winning. John F. Kennedy campaigned for president, warning of a missile gap that supposedly gave the USSR nuclear superiority. His first major test came at the Bay of Pigs in April 1961, when CIA-trained Cuban exiles failed to overthrow Fidel Castro. The humiliating defeat pushed Cuba firmly into the Soviet camp and convinced Khrushchev that Kennedy was weak. The Berlin crisis of 1961 brought the world dangerously close to war. East Germans were fleeing to the west through Berlin at nearly 1,000 per day. On August 13th, East German guards began stringing barbed wire across the city. Within weeks, the wire became a concrete wall topped with broken glass. Kennedy reinforced the American garrison, but the wall remained, a symbol of communist failure, but also of the world's division. The greatest test came in October 1962, when American spy planes discovered Soviet nuclear missiles in Cuba. These weapons could strike the United States with virtually no warning. Kennedy imposed a naval quarantine around Cuba, while Soviet ships steamed toward the blockade. For 13 days, the world teetered on the brink of nuclear war. At one point, a Soviet submarine commander nearly launched a nuclear torpedo before being overruled. The crisis ended when both leaders found face-saving solutions. Khrushchev removed the missiles in exchange for an American pledge not to invade Cuba and the secret removal of American missiles from Turkey. Both superpowers had learned how close they had come to ending civilization. Proxy wars and Détente Vietnam became the defining proxy war of the Cold War era. What began as French colonial resistance gradually sucked in American advisors, then combat troops, then entire divisions. By 1968, over 500,000 American soldiers were fighting in Southeast Asia, to prevent South Vietnam from falling to communism. The war was a nightmare of unclear objectives and impossible terrain. The Tet Offensive of 1968 brought the conflict into American living rooms through television, showing burning cities and desperate fighting that contradicted official claims of progress. Public support collapsed, and President Johnson decided not to seek re-election. While America was trapped in Vietnam, the Soviet Union faced its own challenges. In 1968, Czechoslovakian leader Alexander Dubček attempted to create socialism with a human face, relaxing censorship and allowing political freedom. The Prague Spring lasted 8 months before Soviet tanks rolled into Prague, establishing the Brezhnev Doctrine. The USSR would intervene militarily to prevent any Warsaw Pact nation from leaving the communist orbit. Richard Nixon entered the White House with a radically different approach. His strategy of détente sought to reduce tensions with Moscow while exploiting the growing rift between the Soviet Union and China. Nixon's opening to China in 1972 was a diplomatic masterstroke that fundamentally altered the strategic balance. The first Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty was signed in Moscow later that year, freezing intercontinental missile numbers at current levels. It was modest, but it represented the first time the superpowers had agreed to limit their nuclear arsenals. The age of détente had officially begun, but détente proved fragile. The October 1973 Yom Kippur War saw the Soviet Union supporting Arab forces while America rushed aid to Israel. The subsequent oil embargo brought the Cold War home to American gas stations, with long lines and soaring prices demonstrating how global conflicts affected daily life. The final blow to American prestige came in April 1975, when North Vietnamese tanks rolled into Saigon. Television images of desperate South Vietnamese clinging to helicopter skids as they tried to escape became symbols of American defeat. The domino theory seemed to be proving itself as Laos and Cambodia also fell to communist forces. Throughout the 1970s, the Soviet Union appeared ascendant. Marxist regimes took power in Angola, Ethiopia, and Mozambique, with Soviet and Cuban support. In Nicaragua, Sandinistas overthrew the American-backed Somoza dictatorship. The momentum of history seemed to favor communism. The decade ended with another crisis when Soviet forces invaded Afghanistan on Christmas Eve 1979. Within days, 100,000 Soviet troops occupied the country, installing a friendly government. President Carter responded with economic sanctions, an Olympic boycott, and covert aid to Afghan resistance fighters. The Soviet Union had stumbled into its own Vietnam, though few recognized it at the time. The final confrontation and collapse. Ronald Reagan entered the White House in 1981 with a simple message: America was back, and the Soviet Union was finished. Where previous presidents had sought accommodation, Reagan saw the Cold War as a moral crusade between freedom and tyranny. He called the USSR an evil empire and predicted communism would end up on the ash heap of history. Reagan matched his harsh rhetoric with a massive military buildup. Defense spending soared as America developed new weapons designed to overwhelm Soviet defenses. The Strategic Defense Initiative, dubbed Star Wars, promised space-based weapons to shoot down incoming missiles. Soviet leaders feared it might work and spent billions developing countermeasures their economy couldn't afford. The Reagan Doctrine extended American support to anti-communist insurgents worldwide. In Afghanistan, the CIA funneled weapons to Mujahideen fighters battling Soviet occupation. In Nicaragua, American-backed Contras fought the Sandinista government. The Soviet Union found itself fighting costly proxy wars, while its economy stagnated under military spending. Everything changed in March 1985 when Mikhail Gorbachev became Soviet leader. Unlike his elderly predecessors, Gorbachev recognized the system was failing and needed reform. His policies of glasnost, openness, and perestroika, restructuring, were intended to revitalize communism, but ended up unleashing forces that destroyed it. The Chernobyl nuclear disaster in April 1986 became a metaphor for Soviet failure. The cover-up and fumbling response revealed a government that could no longer control events. For the first time in Soviet history, leaders publicly admitted their failures. Arms control negotiations accelerated dramatically. The Intermediate-Range Nuclear Forces Treaty of 1987 eliminated an entire class of weapons from Europe with unprecedented verification procedures. Reagan's famous challenge to tear down this wall during his Berlin visit seemed rhetorical, but events were already making it reality. Gorbachev's 1988 announcement that the USSR would unilaterally reduce conventional forces in Eastern Europe effectively ended the Brezhnev Doctrine. For the first time since World War II, Eastern European countries could choose their destiny without fear of Soviet tanks. The year 1989 became the year of miracles. In Poland, solidarity won stunning electoral victories. Hungary opened its border with Austria, allowing East Germans to flee westward. On November 9th, confused East German guards opened Berlin Wall checkpoints after receiving garbled orders. Within hours, thousands were attacking the wall with hammers and pickaxes. The dominoes fell with breathtaking speed. Czechoslovakia's Velvet Revolution brought down the communist government without violence. Romania's dictator Ceausescu was overthrown and executed. The Warsaw Pact dissolved before everyone's eyes. Gorbachev found himself presiding over the collapse of everything his predecessors had built. The Baltic republics declared independence in 1990, followed by other Soviet republics. A failed coup in August 1991 fatally weakened his authority and accelerated disintegration. On December 25, 1991, Mikhail Gorbachev resigned as president of a country that no longer existed. The Soviet flag came down from the Kremlin for the last time. The Cold War was over, not with nuclear fire, but with the quiet collapse of an exhausted empire. For 45 years, two incompatible ideologies divided the world. The United States and Soviet Union never fought directly, but their rivalry shaped every aspect of global politics. They built enough nuclear weapons to destroy civilization multiple times, yet somehow stepped back from the brink when confrontation threatened annihilation. The Cold War was fought in shadows by spies, in laboratories developing new weapons, in proxy conflicts across continents, and in the minds of ordinary people who grew up under constant nuclear threat. It touched every continent and influenced every major political development of the second half of the 20th century. The Soviet system ultimately collapsed, not through military defeat, but economic exhaustion. The planned economy couldn't compete with Western innovation and flexibility. Ironically, the very openness Gorbachev introduced to save the system ended up destroying it. The bipolar world that had defined international relations for nearly half a century was gone, replaced by American dominance but also emerging new powers. The ideological struggle was over, but humanity had learned that even bitter enemies could coexist without mutual destruction, a lesson that remains vital in our nuclear age. The Cold War may be over, but its lessons echo in today's global tensions. From Ukraine to Taiwan, nuclear powers still face off across ideological divides. Which Cold War crisis do you think was the most dangerous? What parallels do you see with current world events? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I read every single one, And if this deep dive into history grabbed your attention, hit that subscribe button. There's so much more to explore about the events that shaped our modern world.